Hello folks, Dick Fairburn here. Today I want to talk about how to sight in your M4 AR15 platform rifle. In law enforcement, we went through several different theories of where it should be sighted for our most likely use. And eventually we've come up with a fairly simple process that works for almost any use you're going to use that rifle for. So if you want to hear my thoughts on this, stick around. We'll be back in just a minute. If you're using your M4, your AR15 rifle, which I would say I'm talking here from like a 14.5 inch barrel to a 16, possibly a 20, if you're going to use a longer barreled rifle, but not the AR pistols. That's a different matter that I don't think will fit in with what we're talking about here. What I've come to decide is that for general purpose use of these rifles, the best way to sight them is to look at maximum point blank range. And if you're not familiar with that term, maximum point blank range means we're going to set a standard. And for body shots on human beings, my standard is a 5-inch circle. That means wherever I sight this rifle, I'm going to have a distance where it will never go more than 2.5 inches high or 2.5 inches low from my point of aim. That the shots are all going to fall within that 5-inch circle, and that's a good enough tolerance for body shots. At the same time, when we do this, we can calculate out the range of a 1-inch tolerance, no more than 1 inch high or low. And we would need that kind of tolerance if we have to take a hostage rescue shot. That means a member of your family, or as a police officer, someone on the street, is being held at gunpoint, generally held in front of a bad guy. And we have to thread that shot into a very small point of impact. Now we're not going torso, now we're going the T between the eyes and the nose to shut someone off instantly. Those kind of shots are exceedingly rare, but if you need one, you're going to need it really bad. So we can calculate out that 2.5 inch tolerance for a 5-inch circle, a 1-inch tolerance for a 2-inch circle, and then determine where we're going to actually get this thing sighted in. Over the years, I've heard some kind of crazy ideas. One agency that I knew of, they sighted their AR-15s in for 25 yards. And their theory was most of our shooting is going to be at 25 to 50 yards, so that's a good way to sight it. It is, but on the off chance that you're going to have a long shot, that gives you some pretty weird situations to deal with. If you do zero at 25 yards, remember that your sights are about 2.5 inches above the line of sight. And the farther your sight line gets above your bore line, the stranger those trajectories are going to be. So if you zero at 25 yards, you have a maximum point blank range torso hits from 0 to 55 yards. And that would probably cover the majority of police use of a patrol rifle AR-15 platform. But there are cases where they need to go further. As an example, if you use that 25-yard sighting choice and then you look at where the bullet will impact at 100 yards, it's going to be 6 inches high. At 200 yards, an extreme use for a police patrol rifle or a civilian defense rifle, it's going to be 9 inches high at 200 yards. That's unusable. Now, realistically, a defensive shooting with a rifle at 200 yards is going to be pretty tough to explain. Even if someone's firing at you with a handgun, if you have a standoff distance of 200 yards with a rifle, you have a big advantage. So you got to convince the judge and the jury that you truly felt that your life was in danger and that you had no other choice. You know, obviously, the closer those distances come, the more likely you're going to win that argument. I used to use a 1-inch high at 100-yard sighting, and I got that from a 223 varmint rifle. For years, I have used computer trajectory programs even before there were commercial ones. Some genius wrote one for home computers of the time, which at the time were like an Apple II. He published it in the NRA magazine. I didn't have an Apple II. I had an Atari 64 computer, a long time ago, right? But I knew the basic programming language, so I was able to adapt it and rewrite it for my Atari. So, I had a computer trajectory predictor available to me even before there were commercial ones available. Now they're easy. Now we get them on our phone. Put an app on there, and it's spectacularly accurate. So what I wanted with the scope that I was using, by sighting 1 inch high at 100 yards, that was going to give me a point blank range out to almost 250 yards, and that scope had a secondary aiming point. Duplex crosshairs have thicker lines on the outside, thinner crosshairs on the center. Where that bottom crosshair transitions from thick to thin is always a good secondary aiming point. And that happened to be at 300 yards for my .223 caliber bolt action rifle that I used for coyote hunting. And so I used that 1 inch high at 100 yards for patrol rifles as well, but some people find that a little complicated. And a lot of police ranges don't have a 100-yard line to try to sight it in there. Now with the computer programs, and we'll be throwing examples in here as we go, you can get where the bullet's going to impact at, say, 25 yards, and you can do that sighting in at 25 yards. It has to be extremely precise at that distance. You have to be dead on for the numbers that the computer gave you. But if you do, then you're on that curve, and you will have, for example, 1 inch high at 100 yards. I found that by bringing it in, and it wasn't just me, a lot of people figured this out about the same time, that's real close to a 50-yard zero. And most police ranges, even if they are 25-yard ranges, you can kind of sneak and get back to 50 and sight things in. And what we found was that with almost any 5.56 or .223 load, if you sight it to be dead on at 50 yards, it's going to be real close to being dead on again at 200 yards. And that's going to encompass almost anything we're going to need to do with an AR-15 platform. So we call it the 50-200 zero. And if you look at that 2.5 inch or 5 inch circle maximum point blank range with a 50-200 yard zero, that's good from 0 to 250 yards. You'll be no more than, at 250 yards, you're going to be 2.5 inches below your point of aim. We can live with that. The 1 inch maximum point blank range for hostage rescue shots with a 50-200 zero is generally from 30 to 75 yards. Unless you are sighted at 25 yards or less with an AR-15, which a lot of sights won't even adjust to be on at that range, unless you sight very, very close, because of that 2.5 inch difference between the line of sight and the line of your bore, you're going to have to hold high on those hostage rescue shots. So, saying that it's going to be within an inch at 30 yards means that we're going to need to be holding higher yet up close, and a lot of those shots are likely to happen very close. Now that 50 to 200 yard zero works for almost any .223 or 5.56 load that you're going to put in your rifle. It works pretty well from, we'll say, 14.5 to 16 inch barrels ideally. If you get down below about 11, your velocity is going to be lower, so you're going to have to recalculate that perhaps a little bit. And as I said, with pistol caliber ARs, it's a whole new problem that we have to look at and decide where to sight those things in effectively. I'll show you some range time where I'm sighting my home now, that I'm retired as a police officer, my home defense carbine for the M4. And I have chosen the Black Hills Ammunition 50 TSX load. There are a lot of loads out there that can work perfectly well for home defense. Probably the best thing in most homes is a 50 to 55 grain soft point or hollow point design. They're really kind of varmint bullets. They are definitely not going to meet the FBI 12-inch minimum penetration requirements. But in your house, you want the least penetration you can get. You don't want to shoot through anything that you can avoid it. because you're in a populated area, especially if you live in an apartment house. AR-15s generally lack penetration rather than having too much. But you want to go to the very minimal edge of 5.56 penetration if you're living in an apartment or someplace like that. Hornady ammunition has some urban tap loads that are essentially varmint bullets. They explode and fragment very, very rapidly in a torso. Chances are you're not going to have much coming out the back of someone to have to deal with it. The 50 Black Hills TSX load uses a Barnes TSX bullet, but not the bullet that you can order and load in your own use. It is a custom designed 50, made a lot tougher than the normal Barnes 50. It is the only load I know of that is specifically designed for anti-personnel use by police officers. It was designed as a patrol rifle cartridge. And if you're wondering why he went with a 50 grain, a rather light projectile in that, a lot of police departments have access to what are called LESO rifles. It's a law enforcement assistance program from the military where you can get military carbines. Most of them that I've had at agencies where I've been were M16A1, so you've got a 20-inch standard rifle. A lot of them still have the triangular handguards. Most of them are arsenal rebuilds, so they're perfect in terms of functioning and they're good accuracy. They're good weapons to have. You can occasionally get some XM177s, which is more like an M4 or even sometimes shorter barrels. The downside to using those in law enforcement, where I've tried to get away from them when I could, is they all have a switch. So they are fully automatic. And if that switch is there, somebody's going to play with it and use it. And I'm a believer that you should have semi-automatic rifles for police patrol rifles. And the storage requirements and the record-keeping requirements every year to prove that you still have these things on hand with the military program is just a huge pain in the butt. Those have slow twist barrels. Most of them are all a 1 and 12-inch barrel. So they're not going to stabilize anything past about 55, perhaps 60 grain weight. So that 50 grain bullet works fine in those LESO rifles. It also works fine in a fast twist barrel. And most M4s now have a 1 and 7 twist. And there are people who will tell you that light bullets will not shoot accurately out of a fast twist barrel. That's gun shop commando crap. Lightweight bullets shoot perfectly out of fast twist barrels. You can understabilize a bullet and it will tumble in flight, but you really can't overstabilize a bullet. And so those 50s shoot very well out of fast twist barrels. So that particular round, that 50 from Black Hills, is a very tough bullet. It's made to go through the 8-part FBI barrier test of sheet metal like car doors, of angled windshield glass and things like that, and still give good performance on the other side. Civilians don't necessarily need that. I don't necessarily need that, but I've got a bunch of it, and it is a phenomenal load. So I'm sighting all my stuff in for that 50. At 50 to 200 yard zero, with the light, fast bullets like that, it will actually outperform a little bit. So instead of being dead on at 200 with a 50 yard zero, it's going to be dead on at about 225 or 230. It's going to stretch that out a little bit more, but it will still be within an inch at 200 yards, so within our 2-inch tolerance. If you look at the other spectrum, if you look like the Mark 262 Mod 1 load that Special Forces folks use, that's a 77 grain Sierra open tip match bullet. That's slower. It has a higher ballistic coefficient. It will work okay with that 50 to 200 yard zero. Also, it's going to be about an inch low at 200 yards. So still within our tolerances, but it's going to be, because of that heavy weight and lower velocity, it's going to drop a little bit faster. But the 50, 200 yard zero works with almost any load and almost any barrel until you get down into pistol length barrels. So it's simple. Now the thing is, as I've said, if you're going to zero this at 50, it has to be exactly on target. I mean dead on at 50 yards. Your adjustments for optics, for sights and everything else is generally based on minutes of angle, which is about an inch at 100 yards. And most of the adjustments on your sights or scopes are based on a 100 yard zero. So, for example, if you have a scope perhaps a 1:6 scope you're going to have as a designated marksman optic. A lot of them are going to have quarter MOA adjustments. MOA is a minute of angle. Minute of angle is 1.047 inches per 100 yards. We call it an inch. So quarter minute of angle is going to move your impact a quarter inch for every click at 100 yards. At 50 yards, it's going to have that. So your adjustments are essentially going to be 8th MOA. At 25 yards, they would be 16th MOA. Very, very fine adjustments, which means you got to make a lot of clicks. Now, the first thing I sighted in was my designated marksman scope, and that is a Leupold VX6, the first generation of VX6 scopes. This one has a German 4 reticle with a red dot. It is set up in mils. So the clicks on that dial are 1/10 of a mil. A lot of shooters like to use mils in their scope adjustments and their range tables. The military in particular use mils. I think it's because when they first got into sniper scopes 20, 30 years ago, they were using mil dot scopes. They're aiming points every mil on the reticle. I like MOAs, and the real fanatical mil people will tell you that, practically that anybody who uses an MOA is a subhuman life form. Either will work. The advantage I like to use in minutes of angle is it's an inch at 100 yards. My simple mathematical brain can calculate that. But that scope, as I said, is 0.1 mil per click. Well, what that means is a mil in its purest form is a ratio of 1 to 1,000. Now, there are different mils. There's an artillery mil, there's an infantry mil, there are the mil scopes out there, in my experience, can vary slightly from one scope manufacturer to another, what they're calling a mil. But in generic terms, you can say that a mil is 3.6 minutes of angle, because that means it's a ratio of 1 to 1,000. It's going to be 1 yard at 1,000 yards, or 36 inches at 1,000 yards. 3.6. So that click is going to move that impact 0.36 inches, more or less, at 100 yards. So I'm out there. I fired my first group with the Leupold scope, but after I fired my first group and went down and calculated where I needed to adjust to get it on, I went and made my adjustments, and it didn't get me where I needed to be, because it took me a minute to remember that, oops, no, it's not moving at 0.36 inches for every click. It's really moving at 0.18, or half of 1/10 of a mil. There. I've got there, and there. So my group center is about in there. It only came up about 1/2 inch. So I'm going to give it another 3, and then I'm going to go down here to the bottom square so I have a clean target. There, there, there. It came up about 1/2, and it should have come up 1 inch. It just dawned on me, my problem. Those clicks are correct at 100 yards. We're working at 50 yards. So it is correct. The Leupold is doing what it should. I guess that's why mills are complicated for me. So guys who use them are smarter. The point is, understand that your clicks are going to have to be doubled from their normal value to sight in at 50 yards. Now, I also put an aim point 1X, an H1 micro, on my rifle. And when I looked up the adjustments on those, I didn't know right off the top of my head. I looked online, found it. Again, I had to double them, but when I did, that aim point sight-in process went perfectly. Fire one group, make your adjustments. The next one was absolutely dead on. Well, I think we can call that pretty good. This group is open enough to see the way I like to find group center. From center of that line to the opposite hole, center of that line, and center of that line. So that puts my group center right there. And unless you're a whole lot pickier than I am, I think that'll work. Now the last thing I did was to set my sights. And the sights are there because what happens if your optic fails? The battery can go dead on a red dot. You can take a fall or in some kind of fight situation and you break a scope or an optic. You need to be able to get it off. That's why I always use quick detach mounts. Get your optics off, pop your sights up, and you're still in the fight. I personally don't like a fixed front sight. Some folks use those. A lot of times that's the more low-end price range. You're going to get a fixed front sight. When you're using especially a 1X aiming device like an Aimpoint Red Dot or like an EOTech, having that front sight in there, even though it co-witnesses with the red dot, just kind of slows me down. Spend the time necessary to get everything lined up. If I get those sights out of the way and have a clean image with my red lit reticle, I think it's a lot faster. I'm experimenting with that same kind of process on a pistol that I'm going to report on for old eyes. I'm having some special glasses made, as well as going to a red dot with no sights in the way to see what might be the best for those of us who have old eyes that don't focus on the front sight as well as they used to. So get yourself sighted in exactly at 50 yards. With my sights, I do my up and down elevation adjustments with the front sight. Got them zeroed, folded them down, and then I either put my 1X Aimpoint on if it's strictly going to be a home defense gun, which it rarely is, or the 1:6 optical scope for just a general purpose rifle. So to sum up, a 50/200 yard zero is my recommendation for an AR-15 for either home defense or just general purpose. Maybe you live out in the country and you take it with you in case you see a coyote or something like that. With most loads and most optics, that's going to put you within 2.5 inches of your point of aim from the muzzle to about 250 yards. That should cover the vast majority of needs you have with that rifle. If you need a little further, well then you can hold over and let that bullet drop in where it needs to be. We make things a lot more complicated than we need to sometimes. And as I said, I will be posting tables throughout this showing you where the 25 yard zero would be, if that's the distance you're working at. But as again, if you're gonna zero at 25, it needs to be really on, and since your adjustments are going to be so fine at that range, you can do it. The last thing I will say is you see a lot of stuff on the YouTube about zeroing your stuff with one round. Fire a round and then move your optics or move your sights to where that impact is and you will be sighted on. It's close, but I don't think it's accurate enough because you very rarely have a rifle that puts all the bullets in the same hole. So what you're going to have is a group size. I'll show you on the range how I draw out a triangle with those 3 shots and calculate the exact group center. You need to zero for the group center, and you can't do that with one round. Now, if your rifle is a one-hole gun, then I guess you can do it. And you need to sight every single aspect of your rifle. Before I retired as a public safety director, we bought a dozen patrol rifles for our agency. The idea was that way everything's the same instead of a hodgepodge of some commercial rifles, some less so military rifles. So we equipped every vehicle and some individuals with rifles. Springfield Armory, I'm in Illinois, Springfield Armory makes them in Illinois. They gave us a really good deal. So we set up a dozen Springfield Armory Saints, and they have both flip down sights as well as an Aimpoint Pro, which is a rather large red dot, but it's the least expensive and it's a very rugged, kind of bulletproof red dot sight. The range officer, newly through the rifle instructor course, we were going to do about a 200 round train up for all the officers. They've all been rifle trained, but let's just kind of tune up with this new rifle. And I said, sight in your sights and sight in the Aimpoint both at 50 yards. So I went out with him with the first round of officers who are going to go through the 200 round familiarization course. Worked fine up close, and the bulk of our shooting was at 25 to to 50 yards. When we got to the 100-yard line, we had them laying prone and using their sights. Hardly anyone could get a single hit on target, and we were shooting a 66% size IPSC silhouette, a steel target at 100 yards. They couldn't hit it with the sights. And I wanted the new range officer to have the experience of doing it. I've been training cops for a long time, but I'm leaving, so I wanted him to have this experience. And I said, okay, stop. Let's flip it back. Let's put the red dot back on. And they smack the target every time. And so I asked him, I said, did you sight in the sights at 50 yards? And he said, well, I didn't have the time and I didn't want to waste the ammo. So what he had done was to sight in the aim point 50, 200. And so it was very easy to make hits at 100 yards. After he had done that, he just left that particular rifle set in the bags and he clicked the sights up and down until it matched the red dot. Well, it might look to you that it matches the red dot, but if he's even off a couple of thousandths of an inch, that's going to make a big difference. So don't get lazy on yourself. Sight in the sights, sight in your optics independent of each other, and make sure they're both hitting where you need them to be. So, easiest way to sight in that rifle, 50, 200. Get it absolutely dead on at 50 with both your sights and your optics, and you'll be good to go. I hope this has been worthwhile to you folks, and if it is, I'd appreciate a thumbs up, a subscription. We'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching. Okay, we got them both here now. You ready? Bud got one. Ginger got one. Oh, she missed it. She usually gets them, doesn't she, bud? Okay, girl, last one. You ready? You ready? Yeah. That's all there is till next time.